Welcome to Afro Paradigm. I am Imhotep Kabasubabu, Congolese writer and free thinker. The regime change that occurred in Gabon in Central Africa, through which General Brice Oligui Nguema ejected former President Ali Bongo, has sparked equivocal reactions all over Africa. However, most of these reactions are deprived of a substantial reflection from the perspective of the African Renaissance. From this point of view, it is imperative to stress that almost 30 years after the rising of the intellectual impetus of Africa's renewal in the early 90s, which coincided with the so-called third wave of democratization in Africa, the continent was supposed to be anchoring in constitutional democracy. As propounded by illustrious Pan-Africanist President Nelson Mandela, and eloquently indeed articulated by former President Thabo Mbeki, African Renaissance prescribed a remodeled practice of politics and statesmanship in Africa. Political pluralism, constitutional democracy, the predominance of the rule of law, credible, inclusive elections, innovative governance, propitious for an accelerated development, promotion of political liberties and human rights, as well as Pan-Africanism, were core principles and values to be upheld by all African political leaders. The adherence of African countries to innumerable charters formulated by the African Union, NEPAD, and the so-called peer review mechanism were initiated to materialize a new dispensation of tangible constitutional democracy and development on the continent. However, 30 years down the line, the resurgence of coup d'etat in Africa is a wake-up call indicating that African Renaissance must be rigorously questioned and evaluated. The continent experiences dangerous contradictions which translate African presidents and the AU gravest incoherence and impotence. The African Union and African presidents clearly lack the ideological commitment and political decisiveness needed to preclude some of their own colleagues' incurable dictatorial and predatory propensity. In the last 30 years, several presidents changed constitutions to grant themselves third or unlimited presidential mandates through corrupt constitutional amendments. New African potentates organized several rigged elections and unleashed murderous violence against the opposition. We have witnessed liberators morphing into political predators who orchestrated a neo-patrimonial state capture, pushing their nations to the brink of state failure. Artisanal politicians, improvised presidents devoid of acumen to manage a modern state, lacked strategic leadership to enable their national armies to vanquish militias and Islamists. Yet, when these political afflictions occurred in Mali, Guinea-Conakry, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon, no prominent African president, no regional leaders, not even the African Union proactively stood up to denounce these wars and advocate appropriate corrective actions or sanctions. Some countries, such as the DRC, Central African Republic, Chad, Togo, Ivory Coast to a certain extent, are still plagued by these political pathologies. In paraphrasing former Ghanaian President Jerry Rawlings, it can be asserted that when predatory dictators trample over constitutions, oppress the people, vassalize parliaments, emasculate the justice system, while the African Union is complacent, armies have moral, constitutional, and political obligations to intervene in order to help society return on the rails of constitutional democracy. New coups d'etat in Africa are symptoms of the failure of the African Renaissance and illusions of electoralist democratization utilized by dictators to legitimize their rapacious rule. However, army officers who justifiably indeed eject predatory and oppressive dictators must avoid subjugation to any other so-called superpower and refrain from building new rapacious oligarchies. A coup d'etat is not an end in itself and is not a panacea, but a last recourse when dictators utilize the state for oppression and predation. Now is the time to rethink the African Renaissance, remodel democracy in tune with African authenticity. Pambili, Africa.